The Hermanos House Warning. This is a true story from December 13, 2013. My grandmother Julia warned me about the Hermanos house on the mountain. I should have listened. The bus from Mexico City to San Cristobal took 6 hours through winding mountain roads that made my stomach churn with each sharp turn. I sat in the back row, pressed against a window that rattled with every pothole, watching the landscape transform from concrete and traffic to endless fields of agave, then finally to the mist-shrouded mountains that had haunted my dreams since childhood. The other passengers had gradually disembarked at various stops along the route, families heading to visit relatives, workers returning from the capital, a priest clutching a worn leather Bible. By the time we reached the outskirts of San Cristobal, I was alone except for the driver and an old woman who'd been muttering prayers under her breath for the past hour. Outside the grimy window, the December sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the storm that weather reports had been promising all week. The meteorologists on Channel 7 had used words like unprecedented and potentially catastrophic, showing satellite images of a massive system moving in from the Pacific. But storms were common in December, and I dismissed their breathless warnings as typical media sensationalism. Now, seeing the wall of black clouds building over the Sierra Madre Oriental, I wondered if perhaps they'd been understating things. No one else got off at my stop. The driver, a heavy-set man with St. Christopher hanging from his rearview mirror, gave me a look that seemed to ask if I was certain. When I nodded, he shrugged and muttered something I couldn't quite catch. It sounded like "otro más para la montaña," another one for the mountain. Before I could ask what he meant, the bus door hissed shut and the vehicle pulled away, leaving me standing in the gathering dusk with my backpack and the strange sensation that I had crossed into another world entirely. San Cristobal had that effect. A village of barely 300 souls clinging to the base of the mountains, like a barnacle on a ship's hull, where time moved differently and the modern world felt like a half-remembered dream. The air here was thinner, crisper, tinged with wood smoke and something else, something older that I could never quite identify. My mother once told me it was the smell of history itself, all those generations of joy and sorrow soaked into the very earth. My father, more pragmatic, said it was just decomposing vegetation from the forest. But standing there in the approaching storm, I thought maybe they were both right. The walk from the bus stop to my grandmother's house took me through what passed for the town center. I noticed immediately how much had changed since my last visit 2 years ago. The small tienda where I used to buy candy as a child was boarded up, its hand-painted sign "Abarrotes Lupita," fading into illegibility. I remembered Señora Lupita's warm smile, the way she'd always slip an extra piece of dulce de leche into my bag when my grandmother wasn't looking. She died last winter, my mother had told me, and her children had no interest in keeping the shop open. Another shop where old Don Fernando once repaired shoes while regaling customers with stories of the revolution his grandfather had fought in now stood empty with a broken window. Someone had spray-painted graffiti across the door, but even that act of vandalism looked half-hearted, as if the perpetrator had lost interest midway through. The bench where the old men used to sit and play dominoes was still there, but weeds grew through the slats, and one leg had collapsed, leaving it tilted at a drunken angle. Only the OXXO convenience store remained operational, a fluorescent beacon of corporate persistence in the dying village. Its bright red and yellow sign seemed almost obscene against the weathered adobe buildings surrounding it. Through the window I could see the teenage clerk scrolling through his phone, the blue light illuminating his bored expression. The sight of it felt wrong somehow, like finding a smartphone in an archaeological dig or hearing electronic music in a cathedral. My parents had divorced when I was 10. The separation had been bitter, full of accusations and lawyers and custody battles that left me feeling like a wishbone being pulled in opposite directions. Before that, my father had adamantly refused to let me visit this place, claiming there was nothing good waiting for me in my mother's hometown. He never elaborated, just set his jaw in that way that meant the discussion was over. My mother would cry after these arguments, silent tears that she thought I didn't notice. Years later, I overheard her telling a friend that my father was afraid of San Cristobal, afraid of what he called the old ways that still lingered there. After the divorce, my mother brought me here for my belated 10th birthday. I remember being nervous, expecting to find the backward, superstitious people my father had implied lived here. Instead, the family I met, aunts, uncles, cousins I never knew existed, welcomed me with such warmth that I wondered what my father had been so afraid of. They threw me a party with a piñata and a tres leches cake, and my cousin Miguel taught me to play guitar while my tia Rosa braided my hair with flowers. It was the happiest I'd been in months. Now, at 22, finishing my engineering degree at UNAM, I understood that fear better. There were things in these mountains that the modern world preferred to forget existed. Things that didn't fit into spreadsheets or equations, that couldn't be photographed or measured or explained away with science. My education had taught me to be skeptical, to demand proof and reproducible results. But it had also taught me that the universe was far stranger than we imagined, full of dark matter and quantum uncertainties, and perhaps there was room in those uncertainties for the things my grandmother believed in. My grandmother Julia lived at the edge of town where the paved road gave way to dirt and the streetlights became sporadic. The walk to her house took me past the cemetery, its whitewashed walls glowing faintly in the dusk. Through the iron gates I could see fresh marigolds on several graves. Someone had been preparing for Day of the Dead early this year, or perhaps I thought with a chill they were for more recent deaths. The mortality rate in San Cristobal had always been high, but lately my mother had mentioned it seemed like someone died every week. Julia's house sat on a small rise that offered a view of the entire village, every flickering light, every curl of chimney smoke visible from her front yard. It was a modest structure, 2 rooms and a kitchen that my grandfather had built with his own hands 60 years ago. The walls were adobe, thick enough to stay cool in summer, and warm in winter, painted a fading blue that my grandmother touched up herself every spring. It was a view I had loved as a child, standing on the wooden fence and feeling like I could see the whole world spread out before me. But tonight it felt more like a watchtower's vantage point, as if the house had been positioned specifically to keep watch over something, or perhaps to watch for something's approach. I found her standing in the front yard, despite the light drizzle that had begun to fall. Her weathered hands gripping the wooden fence so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She wore her good shawl, the black one embroidered with silver thread that she usually saved for church, and her gray hair was coming loose from its usual tight bun. She didn't turn when I called out, just continued gazing at the tree line about 100 meters from her house, where civilization ended and the true wilderness began. In the failing light, the forest looked like a solid black wall, impenetrable, and somehow hungry, as if it might surge forward at any moment and swallow the house whole. "Abuela," I called again, louder this time, dropping my backpack on the porch. She spun around, and for a moment I saw naked fear in her eyes, before recognition softened her features. Her face, usually so composed and dignified, looked haggard, aged 10 years since I'd seen her last Christmas. "Santiago." "Mijo, you're here." She pulled me into an embrace that smelled of wood smoke and the herbal tea she constantly drank for her arthritis, a mixture of chamomile, mint, and something bitter she gathered from the mountain herself. Her thin arms trembled, though whether from age or emotion I couldn't tell. Through her embrace I could feel how much weight she'd lost, her bones sharp beneath the wool shawl. "What's wrong, Abuela? Why were you standing out here in the rain?" She released me but kept one hand on my arm, her fingers digging in as if afraid I might disappear if she let go. Her eyes, still sharp despite her 78 years, drifted back to the mountain. A flash of lightning illuminated the peaks for a moment, and in that brief light I thought I saw a movement among the trees, though it could have been just wind-blown branches. "It's your Uncle Eduardo. He came by this afternoon." My stomach tightened, a cold knot forming beneath my ribs. Uncle Eduardo, Tio Eddie, as the family called him, was my mother's youngest cousin, though at 35 he looked decades older. His hair had gone completely white before his 25th birthday, and his eyes held a hollow quality that made people uncomfortable, as if he was looking through you at something only he could see. The children in the village crossed themselves when he passed, and even the dogs gave him a wide berth. He suffered from periodic episodes of what my mother diplomatically called confusion, but what the doctors in Mexico City had diagnosed as schizophrenic breaks. Every few months he would lose touch with reality, disappearing for days or even weeks at a time. The family had tried everything, medication therapy, even a curandera from Oaxaca who claimed she could cure madness with herbs and prayers. Nothing worked. The episodes came like clockwork, usually coinciding with the full moon or major storms, as if he was tuned to some frequency the rest of us couldn't hear. "Is he having an episode?" I asked carefully, already knowing the answer. Julia nodded, her lined face creasing with worry. Fresh tears had left tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "He was talking to people who weren't there, mijo, answering questions nobody asked. He kept turning his head like he was listening to something, then laughing at jokes only he could hear. Then he looked at me with those empty eyes and said, 'They're calling me home, Tia. The door is finally open.' Before I could stop him, he ran toward the mountain. These old legs couldn't follow. The rain was picking up now, heavy drops that promised worse to come, each one cold as ice against my skin. Thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the peaks, not the sharp crack of nearby lightning, but a continuous growl like some massive beast stirring from sleep. I saw my grandmother flinch at the sound, her hand moving instinctively to the cross at her throat. "How long ago?" "Maybe 3 hours. The storm is getting worse, Santiago. He's out there with no coat, probably no food. He'll freeze if—" She stopped herself, but I knew what she meant. If something else doesn't get him first. The unspoken fear hung between us. Everyone knew the mountain was dangerous in purely physical ways, steep drops, loose rocks, wild animals. But there were other dangers, ones that people only whispered about. Hunters who came back changed, unable to speak for days. Children who wandered too far and returned with no memory of where they'd been. And sometimes people who never came back at all, leaving only strange marks on trees and the lingering smell of sulfur. "I'll go look for him," I said, the words coming out before I'd really thought them through. "I know those trails, Abuela. I spent enough summers exploring them with the cousins." "No." The vehemence in her voice startled me. She grabbed both my arms now, her grip surprisingly strong, her nails digging into my skin through my jacket. "Not tonight. Look at those clouds." She pointed to the massive thunderheads building over the peaks, their undersides lit by occasional flashes of lightning that seemed to pulse with an unnatural green tinge. "This isn't just rain coming. This is something else. That's exactly why I need to find him quickly." I saw the war in her eyes, concern for Eduardo against fear for me. Her lips moved silently, and I realized she was praying, her fingers working invisible rosary beads. Finally, her shoulders sagged in defeat. "Wait here." She went inside, her footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. Through the window, I watched her rummage through the old armoire that had belonged to my grandfather, pulling out items and discarding them with increasing urgency. When she returned, she carried an old flashlight that looked like it belonged in a museum, heavy metal, the kind that could double as a weapon, and a rosary made of dark wood, the beads worn smooth by decades of use. The cross at the end was silver, tarnished black in the crevices, and something about it seemed to pull at my vision, as if it existed more solidly than everything around it. As she pressed them into my hands, I noticed she also carried a green wool sweater, hand-knitted with an intricate pattern I recognized as her work interlocking spirals that seemed to shift and move in the dim light. "Eduardo was wearing this when he left," she said, showing me an identical sweater. "So you'll know him in the dark." And Santiago. She paused, seeming to gather herself for what she needed to say next. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and I had to lean close to hear her over the rising wind. Whatever happens, whatever the storm does, do not go into the Hermanos' house. The Hermanos' house. Even the name sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine like ice water dripping along my vertebrae. Everyone in San Cristobal knew about it. A small adobe structure in a clearing halfway up the mountain built decades ago by twin brothers who'd lived as hermits, growing their own food and rarely coming down to the village. Marcos and Manuel Hermanos, though some said those weren't their real names. They died when I was very young, though the circumstances remained murky. Some said it was a murder-suicide, others claimed they'd simply starved to death during a particularly harsh winter. But everyone agreed on one thing: the house had been wrong even before they died, and death had only made it worse. It's been abandoned for 20 years, Abuela. Abandoned, yes. Empty, no. Her voice carried a weight of certainty that made my skin crawl. There are places on this mountain that even las brujas won't approach. The Hermanos' house is one of them. Promise me, Santiago. Promise you won't go inside no matter what. I promise, I said, though the words felt hollow in my mouth like speaking through cotton. She studied my face for a long moment, and I got the feeling she could see straight through my lie. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts but still sharp, seemed to penetrate to my very soul. Then she pulled something else from her pocket, a small vial of what looked like oil with herbs suspended in the liquid. The glass was old, hand-blown with tiny bubbles trapped in its surface. "Put this on your forehead," she instructed. When I hesitated, she uncapped it herself and dabbed the oil on my skin with fingers that trembled slightly. It smelled of sage and something else, something earthy and old that made my nose burn. The oil was warm, almost hot, and seemed to sink into my skin immediately. For protection. From what? From things that hunt in storms like this. From things that wear familiar faces but aren't what they seem. She glanced again at the mountain, and I saw her shudder. And from the women who live where no one should be able to survive. I kissed her forehead and turned toward the mountain. The trail entrance was barely visible in the growing darkness, just a gap between two large pine trees that looked like sentinels. As I walked away, I heard her call out one more time, "Santiago, don't trust anyone you meet on the trail. Not tonight. The storm brings out things that shouldn't exist." The first steps onto the trail brought an immediate change in atmosphere. The sounds of the village dogs barking, televisions murmuring, the distant hum of generators, all cut off as if someone had thrown a switch. In their place was a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums, broken only by the rain hitting leaves and the occasional rumble of thunder that seemed to come from beneath the earth rather than above it. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes, calling out for Eduardo periodically, when the smell hit me again, stronger now, unmistakably sulphurous, like a hot spring gone bad. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, carried on a wind that moved against the direction of the storm. That should have been my first warning that something was fundamentally wrong, but I pressed on, driven by a combination of familial duty and stubborn pride. The trail I remembered from my youth seemed different now. Trees I'd used as landmarks had shifted position, or perhaps grown in ways that defied logic. A rock formation that should have been on my left appeared on my right. The path itself seemed to writhe beneath my feet, sometimes wide and clear, other times narrowing to barely a deer track. My flashlight beam flickered intermittently, though I'd put fresh batteries in before leaving the city. After another 10 minutes of climbing, I heard them, voices low and conversational coming from somewhere ahead. Relief flooded through me. Maybe Eduardo had found other hikers, people who could help me get him down safely. But as I drew closer, something about the voices made me slow my pace. They had an odd quality, like an echo that comes before the original sound or two recordings played slightly out of sync. I found them in a small clearing just off the main trail, Two men sat beside what had once been a fire, but was now just a circle of blackened stones, with no embers, no heat, not even the smell of recent burning. They wore clothes that seemed both contemporary and antiquated, jeans and work shirts, but cut in a style I associated with old photographs. In the darkness, I couldn't make out their features clearly, just the general shape of them, and the unsettling brightness of their eyes, which reflected my flashlight beam like a cat's. "Good evening," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm looking for my Uncle Eduardo, about this tall white hair wearing a green sweater. Have you seen him?" The man on the left turned his head toward me with a movement that seemed too smooth, too fluid, like oil pouring. "Eduardo doesn't pass through here at these hours. Doesn't pass at these hours," the other one repeated immediately, but not quite in unison, creating a discordant echo effect that made my teeth ache. There was something fundamentally wrong about how they spoke. Not just the repetition, but the cadence itself. It was like they were attempting to mimic human speech patterns from memory, getting close but not quite achieving authenticity, the uncanny valley of conversation. "He's not well," I explained, taking an involuntary step back. "He has episodes, gets confused. My grandmother Julia is very worried." "Julia," the first one said, and I heard something like recognition in his voice, though it could have been mockery. "We know Julia." "Know Julia," the second echoed, and this time I was certain there was amusement in the repetition. "Then you know she's old, she's scared. I need to find Eduardo before the storm gets worse. Can you help me?" They sat in perfect stillness for so long I wondered if they'd heard me. Not just still, unnaturally motionless, without the tiny movements that living things make unconsciously. No breathing visible in their chests, no shifting of weight, no blinking. Then the first one stood with a motion that seemed to skip frames, one moment sitting the next, standing directly in front of me. Even a foot away, his features remained indistinct, as if shadows clung to him, regardless of where my light fell. But his eyes were perfectly clear, and they were wrong. The irises seemed to spiral inward like drain holes, and looking at them made me dizzy. "You shouldn't be here tonight," he whispered. Though whispered wasn't quite right. His voice seemed to bypass my ears entirely and manifest directly in my mind. "He doesn't travel alone." "What do you mean?" "There are things hunting in this storm. Old things. Hungry things." He leaned closer, and I smelled earth and decay and something chemical like formaldehyde. "Turn back Santiago." I hadn't told him my name. The realization hit me like cold water, sending adrenaline surging through my system. I stepped back, my hand instinctively going to the rosary in my pocket. The man, or whatever it was, smiled, revealing teeth that were too numerous and too sharp. "Oh, you're expected. They've been waiting for one from Julia's line, but not tonight. Tonight is for other business." "What other business?" Instead of answering, both figures turned their heads in perfect synchronization toward the deeper forest. They were looking at something I couldn't see, and their posture shifted to something predatory alert. "They're moving," the second one said, speaking independently for the first time. "The boundary's thin when the storm comes." "Boundaries?" I asked, but they were no longer paying attention to me. They began walking toward the tree line, their movements now perfectly human, which was somehow more disturbing than their earlier strangeness. Just before they disappeared into the darkness, the first one turned back. "If you insist on continuing, boy, remember this. Not everything that looks human is human, and not everything that looks monstrous is your enemy. The real danger tonight wears a familiar face." Then they were gone, not walking away, but simply absent, as if they'd never been there at all. Only the cold fire pit remained, as evidence of their presence, that, and the lingering smell of earth and chemicals. I stood there for a moment, my heart hammering against my ribs, trying to process what had just happened. Every rational part of my mind wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination, maybe something in the air from the approaching storm affecting my perception. But the oil my grandmother had placed on my forehead still burned warm, and the rosary in my pocket seemed to pulse with its own heat, and I knew that what I'd encountered was real in a way that transcended normal reality. The smart thing would be to turn back. To return to my grandmother's house, wait out the storm, and search for Eduardo in the morning with a proper rescue party. But even as I thought it, I knew I couldn't. Something was happening on this mountain tonight, something that had been building for perhaps years, and Eduardo was caught in the middle of it. I resumed climbing my flashlight beam, sweeping back and forth across the trail. The rain had intensified, turning the path into a stream of muddy water that made each step treacherous. Lightning flashed more frequently now, revealing snapshot glimpses of the forest that looked different each time. Trees in different positions, shadows that didn't match their sources. And once I could have sworn figures standing among the branches watching. After what felt like an hour, but was probably less, I saw it through a break in the trees, the clearing where the Hermanos house stood. Even from a distance, even in the darkness, I could see a faint light emanating from within a sick yellow glow that pulsed like a diseased heartbeat. That was impossible. The house had been abandoned for 2 decades. There was no electricity, no one to light candles or lamps. Yet the light was undeniably there, and as I watched, a shadow passed across one of the broken windows. Something was inside. I started to move toward it, drawn by horrible curiosity, when I heard the laughter. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound like crystal breaking in reverse, beautiful and terrible and entirely inhuman. It was answered by more laughter from different directions, creating a symphony of malevolent joy that made my skin crawl. I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against a tree, trying to become invisible. In the darkness, with only the intermittent lightning for illumination, I saw them. 3 women, though women was both accurate and inadequate to describe what I was seeing. They wore black dresses that seemed to be cut from shadow itself, moving independently of the wind. Their faces were hidden beneath cowls, but their hands were visible, and they were wrong. 2 long, 2 jointed fingers that bent in ways that hurt to observe. They weren't walking on the ground. They stood on branches that couldn't possibly support human weight, thin switches that should have snapped immediately. But they stood there as if gravity was optional, as if the normal rules of physics were merely suggestions they chose to ignore. One of them turned toward my hiding spot, and though I couldn't see her face, I felt her attention like cold fingers probing at my mind. The oil on my forehead flared hot, and she recoiled slightly, a hiss escaping from beneath her cowl. "Not yet," one of them said, her voice like wind through a graveyard. "This one is for later. Tonight we have other prey." They laughed again, that horrible crystalline sound, and began moving through the trees with impossible grace, heading toward the Hermanos house. As they moved, they left traces in the air, not quite visible, not quite invisible like the afterimage of a bright light, but in reverse streaks of darkness that lingered before fading. I waited until they were gone, counting to 100, then 200 before I dared to move. My legs shook as I stood, whether from fear or from crouching so long I couldn't tell. The Hermanos house still glowed with that sick light, and now I could hear something from within, a rhythmic sound like chanting, though in no language I recognized. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee down the mountain and never look back. But then I heard another sound cutting through the chanting, a human voice crying out in distress. It was muffled, distorted, but unmistakably real. Eduardo. My uncle was in that house, and whatever those things were, they were doing something to him. I thought of my grandmother waiting in her kitchen, praying for our safe return. I thought of my promise not to enter the house, and I thought of the deeper promise, the unspoken one that family looks after family no matter the cost. I pulled out the rosary, wrapped it around my left hand until the wooden beads dug into my skin. The cross I held like a knife pointed outward. It was a pitiful defense against whatever waited in that house, but it was all I had. The path to the clearing was treacherous, made worse by the storm that had now reached its full fury. Rain came down in sheets, turning the ground into mud that sucked at my feet. Lightning struck somewhere close, the thunder immediate and deafening, and in that moment of brilliant illumination I saw the Hermanos house in all its decrepit glory. It should have collapsed years ago. The roof was partially caved and the adobe walls cracked and crumbling. Windows were broken, the door hung off its hinges. Yet it stood held together by something other than physical structure, something that made my eyes water to look at directly. As I approached, I noticed details that made no sense. The rain that fell everywhere else seemed to bend around the house, leaving a dry circle about 3 feet from the walls. The weeds and grass that grew wild everywhere else on the mountain stopped abruptly at the edge of this circle, as if afraid to come closer. And the smell, God, the smell! It was sulfur and copper and something organic like meat left to rot in the sun. Through the broken window I could see shadows moving in that diseased yellow light. The chanting had stopped, replaced by what sounded like conversation, though the words were incomprehensible, full of consonants that human throats shouldn't be able to produce. I circled the house, looking for Eduardo, trying to understand what I was dealing with. Through a gap in the wall, I glimpsed the interior. Candles everywhere, hundreds of them, their flames burning in colors that shouldn't exist. And in the center of the main room, a circle drawn in something dark that had dried to the consistency of rust. Inside the circle was a figure that might have been Eduardo. It was hard to tell because whoever it was writhed and contorted their body, bending in ways that bones shouldn't allow. The 3 women stood at points around the circle, their hands raised fingers making complex gestures that left trails in the air. But there was someone else there, someone I hadn't expected to see. A 4th figure stood just outside the circle, and with a shock that felt like ice in my veins, I recognized the green sweater, the white hair. Eduardo, standing calmly watching whatever was happening in the circle with an expression of mild interest. If Eduardo was standing there, who was in the circle? The figure in the circle writhed again, and in a flash of lightning that penetrated through the broken roof, I saw its face clearly. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. It was me. Or rather, it was something wearing my face, twisted in an expression of agony I'd never worn. The features were perfect. The scar above my left eyebrow from when I'd fallen off my bike at age 7, the slightly crooked nose from a football injury in high school. But the eyes were wrong, completely black, reflecting the candlelight like pools of oil. Eduardo turned as if sensing my presence, and when he smiled I saw that his teeth had been filed to points. No, not filed. They were growing that way, pushing through his gums, even as I watched blood trickling down his chin. "Santiago," he said, his voice layered with harmonics that shouldn't come from a human throat. "Right on time. We were wondering when you'd arrive." "Tio Eddie?" My voice cracked like I was 13 again. "What's happening? What is that thing?" "That thing," one of the women in black said, lowering her hood to reveal a face that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, with skin like porcelain and eyes that held the depth of centuries, "is a placeholder, a reservation, you might say." The thing with my face screamed a sound that made my teeth ache and my eyes water. Its body contorted spine, bending backward until its head nearly touched its heels, and I heard bones crack and reset themselves in new configurations. "You see," Eduardo continued conversationally as if we were discussing the weather, 20 years ago a mistake was made. The Hermanos brothers thought they could contain something that had no business being contained. They died for their arrogance, but their binding held until tonight." "The storm," another woman added, her voice like grinding glass. "Storms like this weaken the boundaries between what is and what should never be. We've been waiting for one powerful enough." "But we needed an anchor," Eduardo said, stepping closer to the circle. "Something to hold the door open once we break it. Blood calls to blood, Santiago. Julia's blood, Your blood. The same blood that flows through my veins, though mine has been improved. I gripped the rosary tighter, feeling the beads bite into my palm. You're not my uncle anymore. Oh, but I am. I'm more myself than I've ever been. He laughed, and it was Eduardo's laugh, just with something else underneath it, like a second voice, laughing a fraction of a second later. All these years of episodes, all those times I disappeared, I was being prepared, hollowed out bit by bit to make room for something greater. The thing in the circle had stopped screaming. It lay still now, breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. As I watched, its features began to blur, becoming less like me and more like something else, something older and infinitely more wrong. "You want to know what happened here 20 years ago?" Eduardo asked. "Let me show you." He gestured, and the air in front of me shimmered like heat waves off hot asphalt. Images formed, not quite solid, not quite translucent, but something in between. I saw the Hermanos' house as it had been, neat, well-maintained, surrounded by cultivated fields, the brothers identical down to the way they walked, working their land in perfect synchronization. Then a woman arriving in the night, young, beautiful, terrified. She was running from something, begging for sanctuary. Lucia Delgado, Eduardo narrated, escaped from the convent of the Sacred Heart in Mexico City. The church said she was possessed. They were planning an exorcism. The images shifted. The brothers taking her in, hiding her in the back room. Men in dark suits arriving, searching. Priests with them carrying silver cases that hurt to look at even in the vision. The brothers lying, saying they'd seen no one. "Kind," one of the women commented. "Foolish, but kind." The vision continued. Days passing, the woman, Lucia, growing stranger, not eating, not sleeping, speaking in languages the brothers didn't recognize. And then one night her body contorting, bones breaking and reforming, something else looking out through her eyes. "The possession was real," I whispered. "Possession is such a limited word," Eduardo corrected. "She was a door, a living portal between worlds. The thing inside her had been trying to come through fully, but the church's bindings, weak as they were, prevented it. Here without those bindings." The vision showed horror. The brothers trying to restrain Lucia as it began to change. Not into something else, but into everything else, a constantly shifting mass of possibilities, each more terrible than the last. They managed to draw a circle with their own blood trapping her inside, but they knew it wouldn't hold for long. "So they made a choice," Eduardo said. "They completed a binding ritual they only half understood, using their own lives as the seal. It worked after a fashion. The thing couldn't leave, couldn't fully manifest, but it also couldn't be destroyed. It waited, sending out fragments of itself when it could, seeds looking for fertile ground. Seeds like what's in you. Seeds like what's been in me since I was 15 and made the mistake of exploring this house." He touched his chest almost affectionately. "It's been growing ever since, fed by my episodes, my disappearances. Each time I lost myself, I was really finding my true purpose." The thing in the circle stirred, raising its head. Its face was completely inhuman now, a constantly shifting mass of features. Eyes appearing and disappearing, mouths opening in impossible places, patches of scales and fur and exposed bone. "But why my face?" I demanded. "Why make it look like me?" "Because you're the key," the first woman said, stepping closer to the circle. "Julia knew this day would come. Why do you think your father kept you away? He saw the signs, read the patterns. You have the strongest blood, the purest connection to the old ways that Julia pretends she doesn't practice. That's insane. My grandmother is Catholic. She doesn't practice anything." They all laughed, even the thing in the circle, producing a sound like breaking bells. "Julia Mendoza, who knows which herbs to pick under which moon, who marks her doors with symbols older than Christ, who taught you prayers that aren't in any Bible." Eduardo shook his head mockingly. "She's as much a bruja as these three. The only difference is she chose to bind rather than release." The woman who had spoken first pulled something from her robes, a knife that seemed to bend light around it, its blade black as the spaces between stars. "Enough talk," she said. "The storm is at its peak. Begin." They started chanting in earnest now, their voices weaving together in harmonies that made reality feel soft and negotiable. The candles flared higher, their flames reaching toward the partially collapsed ceiling. The circle began to glow not with light, but with its absence, as if it was draining illumination from everything around it. The thing that had worn my face began to change more rapidly, its form losing all coherence. It was becoming something fundamental, something that existed before shapes and boundaries were invented. Just looking at it made my brain hurt, as if it was trying to process something it wasn't equipped to understand. "You should run," Eduardo said conversationally. "This next part won't be pleasant for anyone with unchanged blood." Instead, I stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the house. The moment my foot touched the floor inside, everything changed. The air became thick, viscous, like breathing syrup. The oil on my forehead burst into actual flame, not burning me, but creating a crown of cold fire that cast everything in sharp relief. The rosary in my hand grew so hot I nearly dropped it, the wooden beads smoking. "No!" one of the women shrieked. "He bears her protections." "It doesn't matter," another said. "He's too late." But Eduardo was staring at me with something like fear. "That's not possible. The holy oil, the rosary, they're just superstitions, hedges against minor spirits." "Unless," the first woman said slowly, "she knew exactly what we were planning, unless she prepared specifically for this." I felt it then, a presence that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and I was just now aware of it. My grandmother's voice not heard, but felt, whispering prayers in languages older than Spanish, older than Latin. The oil on my forehead wasn't just protection, it was a catalyst, activated by proximity to what it was meant to fight. "She knew," I said, understanding flooding through me. "She knew this would happen tonight. She sent me here. To stop us." Eduardo laughed, but there was uncertainty in it now. "You're one person, boy. We are legion." "No," I said, stepping fully into the room. "To finish it." The thing in the circle turned toward me, and for a moment, through all its changing forms, I saw Lucia Delgado as she had been, young, terrified, trapped. Not possessed, but infected. Not a door, but a prisoner forced to hold a door open. "The brothers didn't complete the binding," I said, the knowledge coming from somewhere outside myself, maybe from the oil, maybe from the prayers my grandmother had wrapped around me like armor. "They only managed half. They trapped the symptom, not the disease." "Shut up," Eduardo snarled, his face distorting, revealing the thing underneath. 20 years it's been leaking out, finding hosts growing stronger. The brothers' sacrifice bought time, nothing more. But tonight, with the storm, with all the players in position. I pulled out the vial of oil my grandmother had given me, the one she dabbed on my forehead. There was still most of it left. Such a small thing to carry such weight. "Tonight we finish what they started." I threw the vial into the circle. It shattered against the thing that had been wearing my face, and the reaction was immediate and violent. The oil spread like living things, coating the creature, sinking into its constantly shifting flesh. It screamed, not with one voice, but with hundreds, thousands, all the fragments it had sent out over the years, crying out in unison. The women in black rushed toward the circle, but the moment they touched its edge, they recoiled, their hands smoking. The binding the brothers had made was reactivating, powered now not by their sacrifice, but by something else. Something my grandmother had planned for 2 decades. "You don't understand what you're doing!" Eduardo screamed, his body convulsing as the thing inside him began to tear free. "If you complete the binding, it takes everyone connected to it, everyone who carries even a fragment." "I know," I said quietly. His eyes widened in horror and understanding. "You'll die too. You've been marked since birth, part of Julia's contingency. Your blood, your connection." "I know," I repeated. The thing in the circle was dissolving now, not dying, but being pulled back to wherever it had come from. As it went, I felt tugs on my soul and the parts of me that had been marked by proximity to this evil, by blood and fate, and my grandmother's terrible necessity. But I also felt her one final gift, the sweater. The green sweater she'd given me, identical to Eduardo's. It wasn't just for identification. The pattern worked into it those spiraling designs I'd thought were decorative. They were a choice, a way out or a way in. I could put it on, complete the binding from outside and live. Let Eduardo and the thing in the circle be pulled back while I remained safe. Or I looked at my uncle, the real Eduardo, somewhere inside that thing he'd become. I thought of all the others over the years who'd been infected unwilling hosts to fragments of this ancient hunger. They didn't deserve to be dragged into whatever hell awaited. I dropped the sweater and stepped into the circle. The sensation was indescribable. Every nerve ending fired at once, every synapse overloaded. I was myself, but I was also everything else. Eduardo, Lucia, the Hermanos brothers, all the victims over 20 years. I could feel the thing's home, a place of endless hunger and crystallized malice pulling at us. But I could also feel my grandmother's will, iron strong despite her age, channeled through the oil, through the prayers, through the love she'd poured into every protection she'd given me. Choose, her voice whispered, not in my ears, but in my bones. Save one or save all. Complete the old binding or forge a new one. The women in black were chanting frantically now, trying to salvage their ritual, but it was too late. The circle had become something else, not a summoning, but a crucible. Everything inside it was being refined, purified, separated. I chose. Instead of completing the brothers' binding, I shattered it entirely. The thing howled as it was pulled back to its realm, but I held on to the human fragments, the pieces of Eduardo and all the others. It fought me, tried to drag them with it, but the oil burned through me like liquid starlight, and I held on. The house exploded, not with fire or force, but with light, pure white light that turned night into noon for a single moment. When it faded, I was lying in the mud outside, rain pelting my face. Eduardo was beside me, unconscious but breathing, his hair still white but his features human again. The women in black were gone. The house was gone. Even the clearing was different, small or ordinary, just a patch of mountain where something had once stood. I checked Eduardo's pulse, steady, strong. His eyes flickered open, and for the first time in 20 years they were clear. "Santiago," he whispered. What happened?" "It's over," I said, helping him sit up. "Let's go home." We made our way down the mountain, slowly supporting each other. The storm was breaking, the rain tapering off to a drizzle. Through gaps in the clouds, stars appeared clean and bright. My grandmother was waiting on the porch, the light still on. When she saw us, she didn't run forward or cry out. She just nodded once, as if everything had gone exactly according to plan. "The others?" she asked quietly as we approached. "Free," I said, "all of them." She closed her eyes, whispered a prayer of thanks, then ushered us inside. As she made us tea and fussed over Eduardo, I caught her looking at me strangely. Finally, while Eduardo slept on the couch, she pulled me aside. "The binding," she said. "You broke it completely?" "Yes." "Then it's not over. Without a binding, without a seal, the door isn't locked. It's just closed." I nodded. "I know. It will try again. Maybe not for years, maybe not in your lifetime, but—" "I know, abuela." I touched my forehead where the oil had burned. The skin was unmarked, but I could still feel something different there. A sensitivity to things beyond the normal. "That's why you prepared me, isn't it? Not just for tonight, but for what comes after." She studied me for a long moment, then pulled me into a fierce embrace. "My brave boy. My poor, brave boy." We stood there in her kitchen, holding each other while Eduardo slept peacefully for the first time in 2 decades, and I understood that some victories come with prices that take a lifetime to pay. But as I looked out the window at the mountain now, just a dark shape against the clearing sky, I also understood something else. The women in black were gone, but they weren't dead. The thing was banished, but not destroyed. And somewhere in the space between those facts was a truth my grandmother had known all along. Sometimes the best you can do is buy time and hope the next generation is stronger. The oil had changed me. I could feel it, a new awareness that would never fade. I would know when something was wrong, when the boundaries grew thin again. I woke in my grandmother's house 3 days later, sunlight streaming through the window. My body ached as if I'd been pulled apart and reassembled incorrectly. Eduardo sat beside my bed, looking more alive than he had in years, despite the dark circles under his eyes. "You've been in and out," he said quietly, "talking in your sleep, sometimes in languages I don't recognize." I tried to sit up, winced at the pain that shot through my skull. "How long?" "Since we came down from the mountain. Abuela hasn't left your side except to pray at the church." He paused, studying his hands. "She told me what you did, what you gave up to free us." Before I could respond, my grandmother entered carrying a tray of soup. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes were sharp as ever. She set the tray down and felt my forehead nodding at whatever she found there. "The fever broke," she said. "Good. There's something you need to see." She helped me to the window. Outside, the mountain looked different in daylight, smaller, less menacing, but I could see it now what I couldn't before. Thin lines of light like scars in reality crisscrossing the slopes. They were healing, but slowly. "The boundaries," I said. "You can see them now. That's your burden, mijo. You'll always see them." She touched my shoulder gently. "Every crack, every weak point, every place where things might slip through. There are so many." "Yes, and not just here. When you return to the city, you'll see them there too. Wherever people have forgotten to be careful, wherever the old protections have been abandoned." She moved to her dresser, pulled out a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This was your grandfather's. He had the sight too, though weaker than yours will be." I opened it carefully. Pages of notes in cramped handwriting, diagrams of symbols, lists of herbs and their properties and maps, dozens of maps marked with red X's. "Incursion points," she explained. "Places where things have tried to come through over the years. Most are sealed, but seals weaken without maintenance." Eduardo stood abruptly. "I should go. This is family business." "Sit down, Eddie," my grandmother said firmly. "You're part of this whether you want to be or not. 20 years that thing lived in you. It left marks, knowledge. You'll dream true dreams, now see warnings before they manifest." He laughed bitterly. "So I'm not crazy anymore, just cursed differently. Not cursed, conscripted." She turned back to me. "There are others like us scattered across Mexico, across the world. Watchers, guardians, whatever you want to call us. We maintain the boundaries, keep the old things at bay. And if we don't," she gestured toward the mountain, "more like the Hermanos house, more possessions, more disappearances. Eventually something gets through that we can't send back." I stood slowly testing my balance. Everything felt different. The air had texture layers of meaning I'd never noticed before. I could sense Eduardo's residual connection to the other realm like a phantom limb. I could feel my grandmother's protections woven through the house complex as spider silk and twice as strong. "There's more," she said. "The women from the mountain, they weren't destroyed, just displaced. They'll regroup, find another weak point. And there are others like them, servants of the old hungers. They know about you now, Santiago. What you did, what you are. Some will hunt you, others—" She hesitated. "Others will try to recruit you." "Recruit me?" "Power calls to power. You stood in that circle, held a door between worlds. That marks you in ways that will attract both allies and enemies." A knock at the door interrupted us. My grandmother frowned. Visitors were rare, especially unannounced ones. Eduardo went to answer it, and I heard voices, then footsteps. A man entered, probably in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in my grandmother's humble home. He had the bearing of someone used to authority, but his eyes held the same depth I now saw in my grandmother's, the look of someone who had seen beyond the veil. "Señora Mendoza," he said formally, "I apologize for the intrusion." Father Martinez, she replied, and I realized with a start that this was a priest, though he wore no collar. I wondered when you would come. The Vatican monitors certain anomalies. 3 nights ago, our instruments detected a significant event here. His gaze shifted to me. You must be Santiago. I nodded, uncertain. What you did was either very brave or very foolish, he continued. Breaking a binding completely rather than reinforcing it. That hasn't been attempted in over a century. It worked, I said defensively. Yes, miraculously. But it also sent ripples through the spiritual fabric of this entire region. Things that were sleeping have stirred. Entities that were content to wait are now actively seeking entry points. He pulled out a card, handed it to me. The church has a division that handles these matters. Unofficially, of course. We could use someone with your particular talents. I'm not even religious. He smiled thinly. Neither are half our operatives. This isn't about faith, it's about capability. You've been changed, marked. You can either learn to use what you become or wait for something to use it against you. My grandmother took the card from my hand, examined it, then gave it back. He's not wrong, mijo, but be careful. The church has its own agenda, and it's not always aligned with ours. Father Martinez stood. Think about it. We have resources training support networks worldwide. He moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Santiago, you might want to check your mail when you return to the city. You'll find you've been accepted into a rather exclusive graduate program. Full scholarship, of course. The university doesn't know they're sponsoring it, but the paperwork will be quite legitimate. After he left, we sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Eduardo spoke. This is insane. Secret church divisions, worldwide networks of monster hunters. Not monster hunters, my grandmother corrected. Boundary keepers. The things we guard against aren't evil in the way you understand it. They're just incompatible with our reality, like oil and water if water could dissolve everything it touched. I looked at the journal again, at my grandfather's careful notes. A lifetime of watching, warning, protecting. And now it was my turn. What about the house, I asked. The Hermanos house, the site where it stood. Salted earth now, my grandmother said. Nothing will grow there for 100 years, but that's good. It's a scar that reminds the mountain what happens when boundaries are violated. That night I couldn't sleep. I stood on the porch watching the mountain, seeing the slight shimmer where reality was still healing. Around 2 a.m, I saw them. 3 figures at the tree line, barely visible, except for the wrongness of their movement. The women in black watching the house. They didn't approach. After an hour, they simply faded back into the forest. But I understood the message. They knew where I was. They would remember. The next morning, I prepared to return to Mexico City. Eduardo would stay with my grandmother for a while, learning to cope with his new clarity, his unwanted gift of true sight. As I packed, I found something in my bag I didn't remember putting there, a small vial of oil identical to the one I'd used on the mountain. For emergencies, my grandmother said from the doorway, though after what you've been through, I doubt you'll need it. The change is permanent now. You carry your own protections. Abuela, I said, that night you knew exactly what would happen, didn't you? She was quiet for so long I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, I knew possibilities. I prepared for the worst, hoped for the best. You exceeded my best hopes, mijo. You found a third option I hadn't considered. Destroying the binding entirely. Yes, dangerous, but ultimately correct. The old ways of simply containing threats, sealing them away, they just delay the problem. You chose to actually solve it, even at great personal cost. But Father Martinez said things are stirring now that I've made it worse. In the short term, perhaps, but you've also shown them they can be beaten, truly beaten. Not just contained, but banished. That knowledge is worth the temporary instability. The bus ride back to the city felt different. I could see things now, a shimmer around certain passengers, dark spots in the landscape where bad things had happened, points of light where someone maintained protections. Mexico City, when I arrived, was overwhelming. So many people, so many tiny tears in reality, so many things trying to push through. My apartment had mail piled up, including an official-looking envelope from UNAM. Inside, acceptance to a doctoral program I hadn't applied for in anthropological studies of indigenous practices. The scholarship was generous, the course list fascinating, and clearly coded. Symbolic protection systems, liminal space management, crisis response in traditional communities. That night, as I tried to return to normal life, my phone rang. Unknown number. Santiago Mendoza. A woman's voice, American accented Spanish. Yes. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I'm calling from the Montreal Institute. Father Martinez said you might be interested in our work. I haven't decided anything yet. Of course. But I wanted you to know you have options. The church isn't the only organization that monitors these situations. We're secular scientific in our approach. Well, as scientific as you can be when studying things that violate natural law. What do you want from me? Nothing immediately, but people like you, natural bridges between worlds are rare. When you're ready, if you want to understand what happened to you, we can help. After I hung up, I stood at my window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, things moved in shadows, pressed against boundaries, waited for opportunities. And somewhere else, people like my grandmother, like me, now stood watch. My reflection in the window looked different. Not physically, but there was something in my eyes now, a depth that hadn't been there before. I touched my forehead where the oil had burned, felt the lingering sensitivity. The phone rang again. This time it was my mother. Santiago, your grandmother called. She said you found Eduardo. Yes, Mom. He's safe. He's better, actually. Really better this time. Thank God. She paused. And are you okay? I considered the question. Was I okay? I'd been fundamentally changed, marked by forces beyond normal understanding, recruited into a shadow war I hadn't known existed. But I was alive, my family was safe, and I had prevented something terrible from entering our world. I'm different, I said finally. But yes, I'm okay. Your grandmother said you might not visit for a while. It's complicated, Mom, but I'll explain when I can. After we hung up, I pulled out the journal my grandmother had given me, added my own entry, December 16th, 2013. The Hermanos house is destroyed. The binding is broken, but the threat is banished. Eduardo is free. The boundaries are holding but weakened. 3 watchers active in the area: Julia Mendoza, Eduardo Mendoza, Santiago Mendoza. The women Las Hermanas de la Sombra remain at large. Vatican and Montreal Institute aware of the situation. Follow-up required. As I wrote, I noticed my handwriting had changed, become more like my grandfather's cramped, careful script. Another inheritance I hadn't asked for. A knock at my door made me freeze. It was past midnight, too late for normal visitors. I approached carefully, that new sense tingling. Through the peephole, I saw a young woman, maybe my age, holding a pizza box. "Delivery," she called out. I hadn't ordered anything. I looked closer with the new sight and saw it. A shimmer around her edges like heat distortion. Not human, or not entirely. "I didn't order pizza," I said through the door. "No," she agreed, her voice changing, becoming older, more amused. "But I thought it would be polite to bring something." "May I come in? We should talk about what you've started, Santiago Mendoza." I touched the vial of oil in my pocket, felt the weight of my grandfather's journal in my other hand. Whatever came next, I was as ready as I could be. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been watching that mountain for much longer than your grandmother. Someone who's very interested in a young man who can break a 20th century binding and walk away relatively intact." A pause. "I'm not your enemy, if that helps. Think of me as curious." I made a choice that would have horrified my grandmother. I opened the door. The woman smiled, and her face was both young and ancient, beautiful and terrible. She held out the pizza box. "Pepperoni and mushroom. I did actually bring food. Conversations like ours go better with something to eat." As she entered my apartment, I realized my old life was truly over. But looking at the journal, thinking of the boundaries I could now see, the threats I could help prevent, I wasn't sure that was entirely a bad thing. The woman sat at my kitchen table, opened the pizza box. It was indeed pizza, still warm, perfectly normal, except for the faint symbols drawn in the grease on the cardboard. "So," she said, taking a slice, "let's discuss your future guardian Mendoza. Because whether you join the church, the institute, or remain independent, you've already chosen your path. The only question now is how you'll walk it." I sat down across from her, took my own slice of pizza, and prepared to learn what my grandmother had never told me. That sometimes the real terror isn't what tries to break through the boundaries, it's what we have to become to stop it.